failed the smolder. You're starting the intro this time?
God, no. This is your show.
All right. Everybody, welcome back. Patrick and I are here for episode 2 of 2025, and we are still doing our look back at 2024. We want to look at who surpassed and maybe who just took a crap on expectations from last year. So, in the first video, we covered quarterbacks. This video is going to be on running backs. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go down a list of names, guys that either surprised in a positive way or a negative way, and I'm going to have Patrick kind of break down what he thinks went right or wrong for these players that allowed them to land where they did. Obviously, I'm going to chime in with my opinion as well, but I absolutely value Patrick's opinion, which is why he's become a regular on this channel. So, first one, Saquon. And the reason that I have him on this list is he ended up as RB1 and overall number 7. And typically in the top 10, it's either quarterbacks or wide receivers. Very seldom do you see a running back crack that top 10 overall fantasy production. I want to mention, too, that this is half-point PPR that this is based off of, not full point. So, I mean, huge surprise. And I don't think it's a surprise to very many people that Saquon did well. But this, I think was a huge surprise because when you go back, you look at the draft, you had guys like Christian McCaffrey, Breece Hall, Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs. I even saw, it was in, I think, 3 or 4. So I was in 16 leagues last year. I think in 3 or 4 of them, I think Pacheco even went ahead of them. Yeah. Which to me is crazy. So we're used to seeing Saquon's name at the top of the list, but last year he was drafted in round 2 in most of my drafts. Very seldom did he sneak up in the first round, and if he did, it was at the end of the first round, and typically in a 12-person team, not a 10-person team. Or a 10, you know what I mean. So for Saquon, I think there's some really obvious things that went right for him last year, but I would love to get your opinion because, that even in your wildest dreams, I don't think people expected that kind of output.
Yeah, I think that he was the benefactor of some really great health, first off, which was kind of a historical outlier for him, to be quite frank. But I think when you look at his body of work of what he did in New York with the system that exists in Philadelphia, the offensive line, the defense, he was always going to be able to translate that into potential upside. The fact that he got there is impressive. I mean, it really is. I think he was also a benefactor in the fact that the running back depth in Philly is just not very good. Yeah. When you look at that running back room,
you don't like Kenneth Gainwell?
I'm a seller of that stock, actually. So I think that Kenneth Gainwell is nice and Boston is nice.
Was he even still there this year?
That's a great question.
Boston Scott, in case you don't know who we're talking about.
That's a great question. What they showed all year is somehow or another the ability to keep him healthy. And if he was able to stay on the field with that level of production, that level of and especially with Jalen Hurts' struggles throwing the ball earlier in the year, they leaned on him. And the question is, it seemed like Hurts was able to kind of right the ship late in the year.
Yep.
And that makes me question the long-term viability of that level of production.
Well, and that level of production is very seldom duplicated. Nobody's going to go for 2,000 yards in back-to-back years. I mean, it didn't happen back in the golden age of running backs. It's not going to happen now. You know what's interesting is I had a ton of shares of Saquon because this year,
lucky you,
very well. So this year I ended up drafting. So I was in 16 leagues, and I think in 12 out of the 16 I had the draft slot of 7 or after. And most of them were 8 or later.
So you had a lot of potential exposure.
I had very limited exposure to guys like Breece Hall, Christian McCaffrey, Bijan, some Jonathan Taylor.
Lucky you.
But the beautiful thing is I had at least 3 leagues where I drafted Jamar Chase in the first round because remember he had the contract situation. Yeah. So I was grabbing Jamar Chase with the 7th or 8th, and then grabbing Saquon on the wraparound.
Mm. Yeah, that worked out. Right.
That worked out A-okay because Jamar Chase was by far and away wide receiver number 1. And also, I said that Saquon was number 7 overall. Believe it or not, Jamar Chase was number 6 overall, even in half-point PPR leagues. So that was nice. Don't tell the IRS this, but I made a lot of money last year, and I've got Jamar and Saquon to thank because, again, in at least 4 leagues that I had, I was able to pair those two guys. I don't think that we talk about offensive lines enough in the fantasy circles, and this was by far and away the best offensive line that Saquon has ever played for. I think going into the draft last year, a lot of the reservations about Saquon is he going to get the touchdowns because of the tush push?
Yeah.
And Jalen Hurts got a lot of those, still got a lot of those last year, but his production was just insane. You look at that setup, not only did he have the best offensive line that he's ever had, you had multiple weapons on the receiving. You had Devonta, you had AJ, and even when those guys went down, Dallas Goedert had a couple really nice games when he was asked to be the focal point of the offense, and he produced. You couldn't stack the box. You had to respect the wide receiving weapons. You had a fantastic offensive line. You had creative play calling. Everything he lacked when he was in New York.
Yeah.
So for all those people that were saying, well, Saquon's a good runner, but he's not a good running back, I think they just had to eat crow pie.
Yeah, so. And I think, too, that there's some, again, I keep going back to this age curve because in NFL circles, and I mean, if you've been playing fantasy football for any period of time, the age curve is a very real thing. And with running backs, it's a little bit before receivers, and it looks like he's gonna be a little bit of an anomaly as it relates to the age curve. I mean, I believe he was going into his 26 age season.
Yeah, he's still got age on his side.
Like, he really does look like the kind of guy that's going to be able to give you another year or two that a lot of these running backs, with the exception of Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey, who've shown surprising longevity, he looks like he's going to be that kind of back as well. And this extension that they gave him, though, to be quite frank, it's a traditional Philadelphia Eagles extension loaded with a bunch of fake money that doesn't exist. But it's the money that they promised him is warranted of a player that's likely to have sustained success into the future. And that offensive line, to your point, we as a fantasy community routinely do this, where we ignore the peripheral parts of what makes great fantasy players great. And that offensive line was, going into the year, the best offensive line in football, with the exception of maybe Detroit. And you can make arguments for and against. And they will go into this year again, likely to be one of the best offensive lines in football.
And I honestly think, Patrick, if you need proof of how much of an offensive line matters, take a look. And we talked about quarterbacks in the previous video, and we did not mention Caleb Williams, and I'm going to bring him up now. If you need proof of how much an offensive line is going to matter, look at what happened with Caleb Williams last year versus what's going to happen with him this year. So, yeah, absolutely fantastic. And, again, the only reason he's on this list is because he was, constantly going in the second round. I had multiple leagues, like I said, where I had him and Jamar Chase. I had leagues where I was in that 10 spot and ended up going, because outside of the top 4 or 5 wide receivers who were going early, and thank goodness I didn't have any shares of Tyreek Hill, because we'll get to him in the wide receiver video. I was either going with Jamar Chase and Saquon, or I was doubling up Saquon and Derrick Henry, because both of those guys were falling, and I just went running back. I do a ton of mock drafts, and if you're not doing mock drafts prior to the fantasy football season, you're really doing yourself a disservice. And you can do them with your friends if you want to, but I strongly suggest you go out to Yahoo, you go out to ESPN, you go out to all these different websites that allow you to do mock drafts with people that you're not familiar with, just so you can get a feel for these things. And from doing enough mock drafts, I was satisfied with the wide receiver depth in the middle rounds. The running back depth dropped off drastically, as it usually does.
Yeah.
So, just a fantastic year for me. But let's talk about a running back that I did not have nearly enough shares of, that I wanted more shares of, and got poached because we have Bengals fans that we play fantasy football with. And Jordan, who was obviously high in the sky.
I was definitely thinking Jordan in this case.
Yeah, because Jordan's really high in him too. Let's talk about Chase Brown, who wound up as RB number 12. So if you're in a 12-person league, that's RB1. If you're in a 10-person league, that's still an RB2 number. Going into the draft, we didn't know if it was going to be him or Zach Moss. If you remember, prior to the season last year, Zach Moss goes from Indy over to Cincinnati and actually started the season as the starter until he got hurt. Chase Brown took over and never looked back.
Yeah, and he's not going to look back.
He's a stud.
Yeah, I think that Chase Brown has enormous upside. And I think Moss is just an incredibly... he continues to defy reality. I mean, he's he's a first and second down running back that somehow continues to find NFL work. It's quite incredible, and he's been quite serviceable in his time too. So it's not like he's just getting paid to go along. Chase Brown has incredible upside. The question is will Cincinnati be able to find offensive line depth and, quite frankly, frontline talent to be able to sustain a level of production that his talent warrants? And I'm hopeful. I'm just quite skeptical because there's nothing in Cincinnati's past that suggests that they're able to do that. I mean, they don't particularly draft, on the offensive line very well, and to the extent that they do, they don't keep them. They don't want to pay these guys. They didn't want to pay Jamar Chase. They're dragging that process out. T. Higgins, they're about to slap a franchise tag on him.
They just did.
And don't be surprised if he leaves.
Yeah. Trey Hendrickson wants out.
Yes.
They don't know how to manage business.
They don't. Mike Brown, the Brown family, they don't want to pay these guys. And so if you want to have a sustained level of success in the NFL, it's two things. You've got to have a quarterback and you've got to have offensive line play. Yep. And the reality is you've got the quarterback, but you at this point don't have offensive line play. And this draft, I mean, there's some nice interior offensive linemen, but it's a really thin offensive line draft. Yeah. And for all of its benefits in all the other areas, offensive line's not one of them. So although I'm high on Brown, I remain skeptical that the Bengals were going to be able to get their act together to be able to see that potential into production.
And I think the one thing that they did with Brown really well last year that I would like to see them do again this year, but now defenses are going to be ready for it, is they used him out in the flats. It was a pass. I mean, he was catching these passes from Burrow, but it was really just an extension of the running game.
Yeah, very much
to get him out into the flats, out into the open area. He did run a few routes downfield, but most of his catches were within 5 to 10 yards, if not behind or at the line of scrimmage. Yeah. It was just an extension. It was almost like the coach realized, hey, our offensive line is not the greatest. We got to find space for this guy. We got to get him out in the open field. I thought, despite the struggles that the GM and the upper brass have, I feel like on the field level, they did really well with him. But yeah, they need help on that O-line. All right, another guy that I ended up having a lot of shares of, but not because I drafted him, but because he was a free agent. And I didn't draft him in the beginning of the season because I kind of put Bucky Irving, who we're talking about, kind of in that Tank Bigsby backup RB2, maybe goal line work, maybe short yardage work, but not the guy. You had Rachaad White ahead of him.
You're not alone in that analysis. I was as well.
But Bucky Irving, I ended up with multiple shares of Bucky, and he did really well for me. And to be honest with you, he ended up starting in my flex in a number of leagues because when he was healthy, he was productive.
Yeah, I mean, he was a really nice RB1 towards the end of the year, and Rachaad White just really ceded that ground to him pretty quickly. And I like what they're doing in Tampa Bay offensively. Again, as I stated earlier, I don't think that this is. I know they're going to have an offensive coordinator change, and I'm not the highest on Todd Bowles, but the reality is he's not involved in the offense, and I'm not sure that offense is super reliant on an offensive coordinator. Like, I think a lot of this is driven through Baker and the weapons around him, and Bucky being one of those weapons is really good. And they've got a pretty good offensive line. They've invested in it in recent years. They're willing to pay guys to the extent that it exists in free agency. And I'm a buyer of Bucky in the middle, in the short to mid term. How he holds up over time, I don't know. He's quite a physical back given his size. But I'm a buyer of his stock.
I am too. I'm a believer in Bucky because I feel like the one thing that happened last year, you talk about how we seeded Rachaad White, seeded ground to him. I think we kind of knew going into the season what Rachaad White was. And if you're in a PPR league, Rachaad White was the guy that you definitely wanted to target. I still wasn't sold because I feel like as good as Rachaad White is in the passing game, he is less than mediocre in the run game. Mm-hmm. And he is a running back. Yeah. So, hindsight is always 20/20. Looking back, we should have said, okay, we know who Rachaad White is. He's not a running back. He's a receiving. He's a Darren Sproles. Yeah. He is, you think of some of these guys in the past. What was that little guy that played out in San Diego? Danny Woodhead? There's a name from the past.
Darren Sproles time.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. Same kind of role. Hindsight being 2020, we should have known, but we didn't. But all right, let's go on to the next one here. This is a running back on a team that I was purposely avoiding everybody on, and especially him because they spent some decent draft capital on Jonathan Brooks. But let's talk about Chuba Hubbard, who finished the year as RB15 and had an exciting offseason already this year.
Yeah, Chuba Hubbard is quite a confusing case. I have a hard time actually wrapping my mind around him. They draft a running back to come in. Do you remember who the running back was they brought in?
Jonathan Brooks that they drafted in the third round.
I took him and held on to him.
Yeah.
That's right.
How did you forget that name?
He
didn't forget. Don't let him fool you. He did not forget.
I buried that in the back of my brain, so I'd never remember it.
He did not forget that.
The reality is I think he was on his way out, and Brooks had a hard time getting back to the field. He got back to the field, and then he sustained, I believe, what was another ACL.
Another ACL.
Maybe he comes back. In the words of Jim Cramer, sell.
Yeah, exactly.
I love Jonathan Brooks. The upside, I thought the upside was incredible. You tear 2 ACLs on the same knee in the span of like 2 years. This is Hubbard's backfield in the short term. I'm not a buyer of Miles Sanders to any extent. I think he's closer on his way out than he is sticking around. And with Hubbard's extension, I have no reason to believe that the production is going to continue to remain. And I love Bryce Young.
Yeah,
I'm coming around.
I know you are. I'm not there yet, but I'm not saying I won't be. I learned my mistake with Baker.
I think Dave Canales, he did a really nice job with Baker. He did a nice job kind of reviving the confidence of Bryce Young last year. The problem is they've got no weapons to throw the ball.
Yeah.
So you're going to face boxes that are really condensed, and Xavier Legette's a ways away.
I can't even understand a word he says.
Nobody can. His mother can't understand what he's saying. But Adam Thielen, Father Time's not getting any younger, and they've got to find weapons for him to throw the ball. You're going to face boxes that are pretty stacked, but you're going to run the ball a lot.
Yeah, and the thing is, I purposely did not draft anybody from that team because in general, what I typically do is try to avoid teams that have dysfunctional offenses because the dysfunctional offenses tend to become predictable, and guys tend to get hurt. There tends to be botched plays.
Yeah,
they tend like these guys are professionals, but they know when they stink. And
and betting markets understand this.
Yeah,
like when you look at the last 3 or 4 weeks of the season, you will see betting spreads, especially for these really bad teams, really get ballooned, and that's because like everybody likes to say, "Oh, they're professionals," like you just did a moment ago. But for these guys that don't have anything to play for, that have guaranteed money, right? That are on deals that are locked in, right? Guys that have contracts to play for, that have families to feed, they're coming to play every week. But for guys that have guaranteed money, and that's 25 to 30% of the roster that have guaranteed money. A lot of those guys are mailing it in.
Yeah. And not only that, you do have some of the players that are playing for something but don't want a long-term injury because they don't want to get hurt right before they're due for a contract. So I had mentioned the fact that I'm not a fan of drafting guys on teams with dysfunctional offenses. Let's talk about a guy that underperformed in a very big way on a very dysfunctional offense. And I know that a lot of people thought they were going to turn things around, but let's talk about Breece Hall, who I saw drafted as the RB1. There were some people that were not sold on Christian McCaffrey's health in the later drafts. We're not talking about the leagues that draft early like ours.
Yeah.
But even in the later ones, I saw Breece Hall getting taken at number 1 for RB. I never saw him fall lower than the third RB off the table, but he ended up as RB17.
Yeah. I had 2/3 of my leagues I had exposure to Breece. So, I'll tell you one thing. Their inability to pick a running back and who they want to lead that backfield was infuriating. Braylon Allen, I'm not a fan. I am actually quite a fan.
I am a fan
He's
of him.
incredibly talented.
Yeah.
But
not a fan of the usage.
But could you go to like Vegas or like Minnesota or like literally anywhere else? I think Breece has all the upside to be the best running back in the league, but he's got he had an offensive coordinator that was allergic to good play calling, and Aaron Rodgers is a head case at worst, and at worst. And luckily, with him gone, you can kind of detoxify that locker room and then get kind of a fresh start. Because Garrett Wilson's on his way out. Devontae Adams He's already gone.
Alan Lazard out.
Well, he's been approved to search for a trade. All right,
he's out. He's gone.
Probably.
The only reason he was there is because Coach Rodgers wanted him.
That's right. But I love Brees. If he can stay on the field, I'm still as high as I was on Brees last year. But luckily, I should get him for a cheaper price.
Yeah, his stock will fall based upon past performance.
Yeah,
which is not always indicative of future performance.
We're aware.
All right, let's talk about another running back. Now, this guy, I've got him on this list. And the reason I have him on this list is because in a lot of leagues, he didn't get drafted at all. Mm-hmm. Or if he did get drafted, he got drafted very late. Now, he wound up as RB number 22. So in 10-person leagues, that's not even an RB2, but that is a possible flex, a valid flex play. In other leagues that are, a 12-person league, that would be an RB2. I will say that a lot of his production came later in the season. But let's talk about Rico Dowdle because he's a free agent this year. Is he going back to Dallas, or did he do enough to earn a contract elsewhere? What's his future?
It's hard to know. What does Jerry Jones want to do? I mean, does he want to draft Ashton Genty?
So I do have to interrupt you, though, because you just asked, what does Jerry Jones want to do? How can anybody answer that when Jerry can't even answer that?
No, Jerry's got no idea what he wants to do.
He's clueless.
It's impossible to know. The reality is they're going to have to sign Dak to some kind of extension this year, and my guess is they don't want to pay a running back. And granted, Rico Dowdle he's not going to cost you a fortune, but why in the world would you pay a mid-tier running back, even mid-tier money, if you don't have to? You can find those running backs growing off trees. Mm-hmm. They're everywhere. And so Dowdle is a nice serviceable back that you can get in the 5th round. And oh, by the way, if you're going to pair a running back with Dak, who's getting older and is having a hard time staying healthy, CeeDee Lamb, who I'm still a buyer of, and granted I'm incredibly biased because I have him on my keeper team, or on my dynasty team. But I just think that Dowdle is very likely to find a home, whether it's in Dallas or somewhere else, where he's not going to be the running back that's featured. I think Dallas is much more likely to go the Ashton Genty or Omarion Hampton out of North Carolina than they are to rest their season on the good fortune of Rico Dowdle.
Yeah, and Dallas's window is closing. If it isn't already completely closed. Micah Parsons wants out, and it's
you can only afford to pay so many elite playmakers until the well runs dry. And to be fair, a lot of these teams find unique ways to pay players that doesn't eat up salary cap. There are lots of teams that have been doing that for years. Jerry Jones ain't one of them.
No. The problem with Dallas, and I heard this on the radio, this is not my take, I heard this, I'm stealing it. The problem with Dallas is they have become so enamored with the stars that they forget that you have to have the rest of the team around them.
Yeah.
And Jerry is still reliving the Emmitt Smith, Troy Aikman, and Michael Irvin days. I don't know. Let's talk about a running back that disappointed greatly. So this guy was taken, and I never saw him outside of at least, I'd say, middle of the 3rd round. He never went later. So either 2nd round or no later than mid-3rd round. Travis Etienne ends up as RB number 36 last year.
Yeah, I think Etienne is a function of the system around him, almost to more extent than most running backs. I think to the extent that you see Lawrence have a successful season, Etienne will follow alongside. I don't think Etienne is capable of leading a backfield or a team at large to greater success without that of a quarterback driving that success. And I find Etienne to be incredibly a replaceable level player. I think he's a nice RB2, a really nice RB2 on somebody's team. He's somebody that can take place in a timeshare. To be quite frank, I've always been a seller of Etienne going back to his days coming out of Clemson. I know some of other people have been higher, but I don't think he's physically capable of staying on the field consistently. And then I don't think he's capable of carrying the load that a Saquon or really any of these other top 8, 10 type backs are capable of.
So in other words, he's a guy that needs volume in order to be fantasy relevant, but can't hold up to that volume.
No.
So that's kind of the boat that I'm in with him too. So a couple guys that we're not going to mention in this because I don't like to pick on players that were hurt, but you do have the Christian McCaffreys, the Isaiah Pacheco's that really disappointed last year. I feel like I just keep digging a dagger in you with some of these guys.
Yeah,
I apologize.
Yeah,
but their lack of production was due to injury, so we won't pick on them. But here's what we do want to do. We want to ask you to go down to the comment section. Let us know which running backs exceeded or crapped the bed on you last year as far as expectations. A lot of what I do is I base it upon where they were drafted. If you got a guy that was drafted in the 7th round and he didn't do real well, probably not going to make the list because if you're drafting him in the 7th round, wasn't really expecting it to begin with. So if you could go down to the comment section, let us know which players you felt like exceeded expectations or really kind of let you down. Also, make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel. We're going to come back. The next video in this series is going to be the wide receivers. We're going to look back at 2024 wide receivers and talk about those who exceeded and those who really let us down. All right, anything else, Patrick?
Christian McCaffrey let me down pretty bad.
Brees Hall? Jonathan Brooks?
It was a rough year for running backs.
Not for me. I had Derrick Henry and Saquon.
We're aware. You've told us.
All right, make sure you come back for those videos. And until next time, see ya.